Hi, I'm Peter Trins, Director of GRC Solutions at MetricStream, and I'd like to welcome you to this expert talk session on the topic of Integrated IT GRC, Building an Effective Cybersecurity Program. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session, Dr. Michael C. Redmond. Michael Redmond is Director, IT and GRC Consultant and Auditor at EFPR Group. She is also the CEO and Lead Consultant at Redmond Worldwide. She holds an impressive array of certifications and accreditations, and her expertise has been sought after around the world. She is a certified project manager, certified business recovery planner, certified emergency manager, and holds 2 international master level certifications in business continuity. Dr. Redmond is certified in ISO 22301 and is a certified instructor. She specializes in cyber incident response, business continuity, disaster recovery, and emergency management. She is a consultant, author, international speaker, and trainer. She has trained both corporations and government agencies in Nigeria and was endorsed by General Yakubu Gowon, Nigeria's former head of state. She served as the attaché to Chile for disaster recovery for a special project at the request of the President of Chile. She trained agencies for the New York City Department of Health and Mental Health on continuity of operations training. She spoke in Angola and trained over 50 corporations on business continuity and disaster recovery. With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Redmond.
Thanks so much, Peter. I appreciate it very much. This is a very important topic right now. With the coronavirus going on, with different situations in the world, cybersecurity attacks are at an all-time high, never before as high as it is now. What's been happening is that a lot of organizations did what they felt was right, but they weren't using standards. The governance wasn't there. As a matter of fact, the financial community, the banking, the IEC, in the US just came out with a new standards in November for continuity, where it includes a lot of governance. And the cybersecurity, it was assumed it would always be there, but it hasn't been. So these are some of my certifications. I'm not showing them to you to show you who I am. I'm showing them to you to know some resources that you can use. The one problem with ISO's international standards is you do have to purchase one for each individual in the organization using it unless you buy a group license. So, however, they are international, especially for those who have many different countries that you're working with. If you want to use, if you're in the US alone and you want to use the National Institute for Standards and Technology, that's great. I use a combination of the two. So, these are some of the standards that you may want to look at that you may find helpful in the process. So governance, risk, and compliance, we have to have all three. The governance is an overall management approach to IT. So governance is not just the board of directors. It's the CEO, the CIO, the CFO, the CISO. It is all of the management approach to IT risk. How is it being controlled? You need governance and risk management. As we see, many organizations are having events. We've had a problem in the US where some organizations have been affected not having enough security in place. One of them is a well-known communication software that was not expecting to be so popular overnight, but they were during coronavirus. And they found out that when they were saying they were encrypted, it's not the term encrypted that the rest of the world is looking at. So what do your third parties mean? What do you mean? Being able to analyze that risk, part of that risk was they should have said, what if we have to vamp up overnight very quickly? Can we handle it? So knowing what standards you're following within your organization, I gave you the ISO standards, but I also think it's important for you to look at the standards as far as the, I'm looking at my time here, sorry. looking at the standards as far as what you want to use for different areas. Maybe you want to use international standards for some, maybe you're using the IEC for others. So you're having a mishmash, and that's okay, but it must be documented. So you have your program together. That includes the scope of the program, what's included in the program. Are you including third parties in the program or third-party management? It should be. Normative reference, that's what we talked about. What does those words mean? When this one company said that they were encrypted, they meant only a certain portion is encrypted, not the entire process. So making sure that all the definitions are there. What is the scope? Understanding the organizations and its needs. Where might it be? A lot of organizations were not prepared to be working at home. They didn't have security in place at home. People were using just the home internet, and the rest of the family was on it. So they were all had access to each other's information. There was no separation. So making sure you know what could the future look like. I'm making sure the leadership roles are there, and making sure that on your board of directors you do have someone who is technical. One person on the board of directors who understands, whoa, I think you're making some mistakes. The planning, making sure you achieve them. Part of the plans is looking at the policies that the organization has written and is following. Notice I said is written. Policies must be documented. Processes do not have to be documented. So who are the resources you're funding? What's the funding? What are the competence of those people? Is there awareness training? Is there communication? How are you doing all this? So different areas they're working with. A lot of organizations jumped on Zoom because it was available to them. And then Zoom was having problems with security. They were quickly hired a CIO from another organization. They quickly put in everything. They're working very quickly on increasing their security. But organizations didn't check their security before they decided to work with them. So who are your third parties? Are they ready? So you want to identify the critical risks, understand the needs, establish and maintain the business continuity management system. You're saying, why are we talking about business continuity? We're talking about cybersecurity. When you have ransomware, you better have a business continuity plan in place. If you have denial of service, you better have a business continuity plan in place. For many areas, you've got to work together. A lot of CISO positions now are requiring that they have business continuity background as well as information security background, as well as technical background. I'm finishing in the end of May, actually, I'll be finishing my MBA in risk management. I surveyed many organizations internationally. Do you interface with business continuity? Do you interface with emergency management? Do you interface with this? And the percentages were low. So this is important, and I'm halfway, almost finished my MBA in information security. I'll be finished that next year. Again, they're requiring in my school that they understood a little bit of business continuity under the information security. So there is a lot of interface between them now and looking at what that needs to be, and that's part of the governance. IT governance is a structure for aligning IT with the business strategy. Where's the business planning on being in 5 years? I gave you the example of Zoom. Where do they plan to be? They didn't plan to grow that fast. So where do you plan to be, and what happens if the market takes off before you're ready? How do you keep up with it? How are you following a formal framework? Can you take stakeholders' interest into account? Who are your stakeholders? Your customers, potential customers, your employees. How many employees after coronavirus are going to say, I really like working at home. I like not commuting an hour and a half to go to work. I can take that hour commute to work and that hour commute back, and I can work during that time, as opposed to coming home and having to work 2 more hours. So things are going to change. And are you prepared for that? So some important things in the governance. You want to choose what framework you want. ISO international standards, there are 24,000. So which of the ISOs do you want to choose? You can't just say I'm ISO. I had someone that came in, was going to audit them, and I said, which ISOs do you follow? They said, all of them. And so we know that's not true. No one's following 24,000. The same thing with National Institute for Standards and Technology. There are 60 that are critical and more that are important. So making sure you know the organization, making sure you understand your government. Some of the, from ISO, this is one of the, I'm using their clauses. And again, I'm not saying use ISO, but for people, many organizations are dealing internationally. So the governing body is responsible and accountable for the current and future use of IT. In many companies, it's still the governing body is the board. In others, it's a board of directors. In others, there's 2-tier, maybe it's supervisory and executive board. Whatever it is, you need to have that defined and documented. You're supposed to plan and develop, this is all governance, plan and develop operations. You know, what again is the supply and the future use? What are the regulatory obligations that you have to meet? What's interesting in the state when we deal with cybersecurity is you're also dealing with privacy. New York State has the SHIELD law for privacy. California has its privacy. International is GDPR. There are other states also that are coming up with their own privacy requirements. It's changing. Some of those privacy requirements say they have the right to take their information with them. Some of the information says they have the right to say they don't want you keeping information and you have to delete it from your backups. Again, cybersecurity, business continuity, everybody working together. So the managers are responsible for ensuring the achievement of the objectives. And you have many hierarchies, and making sure that achievement is done through that hierarchy. One of the best ways of governing is through the use of policies, not a policy, which you can have one policy that includes majority, but I suggest you have a policy for segregation of duties, a policy for access management, a policy for information security documents that may not be cyber related, but paper documents. There are many different areas that you need to consider. The governing body has to work with an advised executive management. What I've been doing a lot of the last few years is coming in and doing training programs for the executive teams. What are your responsibilities? What do you have to do? What are the different standards? And even taking it down to simple terminology so they understand what a honeypot is, what's a Trojan, what's a zombie. These are terms they should know to understand what's happening, to be able to communicate in the time of an event. The governing body has to make sure that the internal and external environment are regularly monitored. Now, part of that monitoring includes internal audits. And you can't have an internal auditor auditing cybersecurity if they don't have the background. So making sure that the policies support the legislation, support best practice, the most important that they're effective. You know, there are mechanisms you want to have in place. Do you understand the readiness of the business strategies? Capability within the organization to undertake required changes. This has been a problem. A lot of organizations around the world are saying, we weren't ready for this. We weren't able to do it. One of the things that I've worked with many school districts, and what I'm very proud of is all the school districts that I have worked on pre-planning, pre-auditing, had all of their students had computers handed to them with the proper software, with everything in place, all within the first few days of deciding that the students were going to work at home. They had pre-bought everything. Everything was sitting there ready. They didn't know what would happen, but just in case they ever had to recover all the students at another location, how would they do it remotely? They were prepared. I can't say that for many school systems around the world. But fortunately, I'm very proud of the fact that the ones that I worked with, we made sure that they were. So you want to make sure you have internal control. Now, this is not just audit coming in. This is making sure you have a defined set of responsibilities, who's doing what, and where's the gaps? Where is there something that needs to be done that's not being taken care of? So governance, risk, and compliance. I've talked a lot about governance because it's extremely important. We usually just talk about the risk. And the governance is the part that has gotten many organizations in trouble in the last few months. The governance, the board of directors said, we didn't even know these were requirements. Why not? Well, we didn't have the background. Why not? I read yesterday that one of the major banks, international, has removed someone from their board of directors, and they're replacing them. People are starting to look at, is the board providing the type of governance that we need to have, or are they simply good in the way they worked before? There's reevaluation. There's going to be a shakeup in boards. Yesterday was the first example, but there'll be more. So compliance is knowing what standards and regulations you have to keep. One of the things you want to do is a maturity level. Where is your organization? Because you cannot be doing a stage 5 response if you're only on a stage 1 level. This came from the World Economic Forum all the way back in 2012. Here we are in 2020, 8 years later, and many organizations have never done a maturity level review. Never. One of the ones internationally, which is great to use, it's a US one, but I highly suggest it. It's the IEC.gov maturity model. It's free. It's approximately 20 pages long, very detailed, very good. So now we're getting into your risk analysis. This has many components. The potential risk, the outside expertise that you need to do it. This is why I often come into an organization as a consultant. 50% of my time is a consultant, 50% of my time is as an auditor. So obviously I don't audit my own work. So what if you do not have a risk assessment expert? Bringing a consultant in who can do that for you, just a portion, is a huge help. Identifying the risk to your organization is to be customized. Your vulnerabilities are different, the threats are different, and certainly your exposures are different. You know, how are you mitigating? And are you getting information sources? Are they credible? Are you looking at the right information sources, or are you just reading something on LinkedIn that someone wrote an article themselves and they have no background? And I love LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn every day. I post at least 4 or 5 articles per day from other people that I read and see there, and I often write my own. So what are the lost potentials? What's the probability of events? All of this has got to be defined. You've got to track those risks. How well is your program working? If you have a SIM program in place and it has a lot of false positives, that means you didn't work on your correlation rules. That's a risk. You're not going to know if you have so many false positives, you're going to think when something happens, it's just another false positive. I don't need to worry about it. That's not true. You do. Maybe. Maybe it's not a false positive. So taking the time to go through and make sure your correlation rules are done. I know some organizations I've come into said, when we bought the SIM, it said that it was off the shelf, ready to go. That simply means they didn't have to add more software, that the software was complete. It doesn't mean they didn't have to put the rules in. If this server does this, then that. If this, then that. All of your correlation rules have got to be part of your SIM. So making sure you have a systematic approach to the risk tracking. Your risk impact and response, you're doing all three together. What's your security policy? What are the controls that you're implementing in today's world? Those controls should be reviewed at least annually, if not more often, but at least annually. Especially after an audit if something hasn't worked, especially after a cybersecurity incident response test if something hasn't worked. You want to assess the ongoing threats, what's happening, what's out there today. You know, some of the events that have happening recently, or many people at home are clicking on things they shouldn't click because they think it's a coronavirus message from their job. They're clicking on something because oh, it's a big one. People were clicking at home on a coronavirus map. They were actually clicking and releasing different types of malware. So making sure you continue to do awareness training is part of those risk assessments. It's never ending. So some of the reasons you're doing it, number of security incidents are being reported. There's been a lot of information being affected right now. More awareness on organizations that they have to have policies that are implemented, that the governance has to review those policies, that there's new laws, there's new realizations. You know, the network administrator is not going to be able to protect the entire organization. The network can be protected. But what about access controls? What about who's accessing what? What if the network person doesn't have segregation of duties and they're monitoring their own work? Who's doing what? So you want to look at the whole enterprise. The people, the building, the equipment, the reputation, financial concerns. Where are risks? And why do I say buildings? You're saying buildings. Taking over the HVAC system in a building. Cyber. So before you give cost-effective controls to upper management, you want to make sure you've done a risk evaluation of control in detail to be able to say, this is going to help us. And if we don't do this, this could be the impact for us. And this is what it's going to take to mitigate. So you want to look at regulatory, the standards, the internal policies. I've mentioned those three. Did not mention the market. What's happening with your stakeholders? What do they expect? What are they needing? These are some planning considerations in the risk assessment. Who are your stakeholders? Now, I'm listing some here. I'm not going to go through that in detail, but these are some of your stakeholders. Special interest groups, maybe it's associations, maybe it's ISACA, maybe it's ISSA, maybe it's international internal auditors associations, maybe it's association continuity professionals, but other groups out there that you can get information from, that they can be getting information, they can be sharing information. When have you been attacked? Who else was attacked? So before you start to plan your risk assessment, your planning, the governance, the risk, you're looking at them together at this point. So how do we do training? How are we detecting when we have an event? How do we even know we've been attacked? How do we deal with asset management? Asset management's key. If you don't know that you're running out of storage, you're going to have a problem. If you add in new devices and you forget to make sure that they're part of being monitored by the SIM, you're going to have a problem. All of this is part of the problem. So you want to look at the time frames. When do you want to have what done by? It's good to do something quickly, have something in place, and then go back and perfect it for cybersecurity. But to do it quickly, it still needs to be done right. So your risk assessment will help you identify which areas are most critical and which areas that you have to spend the most time on. Very important. So you're not just responding when you have an incident. You're handling and eliminating duplication of effort. coordinating. You should have server recovery plans, application recovery plans on the business continuity, disaster recovery side. For incident response, you need to have a plan in place, playbooks for Unix, for Linux, for Windows, for legal, for HR, for the board. What is each person going to do at each phase? So not only reacting to incidents, but alerting people that they've been a problem. And again, regulatory, we'll get into that in a moment, but regulatory in some areas require you to notify each and every person who was affected. In some states, you don't have to notify people in times of a breach unless there's been at least 500 records accessed. So counting that, knowing what you have in place, knowing what's there is absolutely important. So part of your planning is you want to define the requirements that you need for regulatory reporting. Now we're getting into compliance. You want to make sure your training program, as well as tabletop and simulation testing, meets standards, compliance. That perhaps you're doing incident response plans, ISO 27035, incident response. What are the gaps and how do we close those gaps? You know, we have COVID 4.1, we're using COVID 5 in planning now, but you still have COVID 4.1 in place, has information. Testing and documenting, reviewing your current policies and procedures. What policies have to be revamped to meet the new standards, to meet the new requirements, especially if you're doing work throughout the US, throughout the world. Different standards, different requirements. In the US, there's different state requirements. Internationally, there's different country requirements. You have to be compliant with all of them if you're going to be doing business in those organizations, in those countries, in those states. So what are they? Reviewing them and finding out what they are is part of planning for compliance. It's not just saying, oh, we did it, we had an audit, we're done. You had an audit against what? Was the audit against saying these are the standards we want to be audited by? Or was this audit saying, what standards do we need to be following? So you need to strategize. You need to have the governance, make sure that they set the requirements and reevaluate after the risk assessment is done. And say, we need to have more controls in place. We need to have more policies in place. We need better governance. So the risk assessment, the governance, they're going back and forth. Now as you're coming up with new compliance issues that you have to meet, now you're going back to your risk assessment. Are we dealing with that? Going back to the governance. So this is ongoing. This is continuous, but you want to make sure you mostly are preparing, but you also want to make sure you have cyber incident response programs in place for when it doesn't work. So this is something I put together back in 2005. It is what people you have to consider, the buildings, the equipment, the processes, the reputation, the financial. You're welcome to use this slide, but please, I ask that you keep my name on this slide. It is copywritten. So when you use it, you must give credit. But this is important. You know, you look at assets, breakdown, sabotage. This is going to affect your cybersecurity. The processes. Can you recover? Can you restore? What about supply chain management? And you're saying, what has that got to do with cyber? Everything. As we found during the coronavirus, many suppliers were not available. How did you manage? Did you have to go to something different? Did you have drop-in shipping agreements already in place? What was in place? You want to look at the technology risk in place. And this is just a quick list that I put together. You want to make sure, again, you're dealing with theft, sabotage. Could be employees doing the problem. It doesn't always have to be external. You want to plan for internal and external. So in review, you want to make sure you have program administration, documented program. You've got procedures in place. You know what legislation you have to follow. You have a budget, and the budget works. You want to have a project schedule and milestones. You want to implement a strategy for addressing needs for legislative and regulatory revisions that evolve over time. How do you make the changes? And one of the changes I suggest is each time you review, go back and see what documentation needs to change. Hazard identification. Do you even know what hazards might affect you? The likelihood of their occurrence, the vulnerability of the people, the property, the environment, and the entity to those hazards. Although we're talking cybersecurity, do you remember that fraud, prevention, anti-bribery are becoming very key in cybersecurity hazards? So you want a plan, response plan, mitigation plan, continuation plan for your incident response, for your cybersecurity team itself. What do you do if you lose access to your location? You have to recover. Can your cybersecurity people work from home if that event does happen? How do you work remotely? Getting a lot of plans in place, aren't we? So it's becoming informed. Looking at some of these, I've listed HIPAA and HITRUST, FFIEC, and these are just a few. But knowing what the best practices are, knowing, if you're going to pick any ISOs, 27001 tells you the cybersecurity, 27002 gives you a lot of mitigations and more controls. 27035 is incident response, 27005 is risk assessment. NISC has many, so choosing that. You want to make sure you have reports in place if something does happen. How many victims? Who was the response? What happened? I have some books out on Amazon. Very proud to say that my book on business continuity management was selected as one of the top 13 books internationally for 2020. So very excited. And during the coronavirus situation, sadly because of why, but the Mastering Business Continuity, the Mastering Your Work-Life Balance, and especially the Mastering Introduction to Cybersecurity have really, really, really been popular and being sold. Many firms have bought the Mastering Introduction to Cybersecurity for all their personnel. These are my audio training that's available. If you can get them on rwknowledge.com. If you buy the book first, there's a discount code in the back. This is how you can reach me. If you have training and speaking engagements, I do that through Redmond Worldwide. Consulting and audits, I do through EFPR Group. I also do ISO certifications where I actually can certify companies through PECB. I know this has been very, very quick. I know we do quite a lot. This is a great conference. I hope you'll be attending the other speakers, getting a lot of information from them, taking the time to learn, take notes. Feel free to contact me afterwards with any questions you might have. And I look forward to staying in touch. And I want to thank MetricStream for the opportunity of being part of the 2020 GRC Summit. I always enjoy the summits both as a speaker and as an attendee. So I want to thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. And I encourage you to take lots of notes and share this. Share this on Facebook. Share about the GRC Summit on LinkedIn, Twitter. Get information out there. Share the information that you're learning. I want to thank you for your time, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Redmond. On behalf of all of us at MetricStream, as well as the extended MetricStream family of customers and partners who are attending the GRC Virtual Summit 2020, I'd like to thank Dr. Michael Redmond so much for this informative and insightful session on building an effective cybersecurity program with integrated IT GRC. This has been an increasingly important topic, as recent events have clearly demonstrated. So thank you again, Dr. Redmond, and thank you to all the summit attendees for watching and participating.